Hello, my name's Alan Rogers. I work with SIL and our office is on the Nungalinya property. We rent a building behind this media building, and many of you will have come over there and used the bookshop at times. We're looking at a passage of scripture today, Mark 14 verse 53 through to Mark 15 verse 15. And you might have watched this already on that Lumo presentation, but I'm going to give you some background to this story. So if you want to watch it at the end, this might help you to understand a bit more about that passage. There are different people in this story. And if you read a book, then you'll find that in that book, the author introduces the different members of that book, the people who are important to the plot of that book. It's the same in a video. If you're watching a video or a movie, then you'll see that the author has different ways of introducing people into that plot, so that when the plot comes to the end, you can see, you know all the people at the start, and you can see the way it all worked out in the end. So what I'm going to do today is to talk about the different people in this plot, so that you have a bit better understanding of what this passage is about, and then perhaps you'd like to look at the Lumo recording at the end. So there are different people here, some of them mentioned in this plot and some of them are not, but they're all important. The first person I want to talk about is John. Now, John's not mentioned in this plot, but if we look at John's gospel, we find out a lot more about John. And we find out a really astounding thing. Here in this one, it says, Peter followed Jesus and all of the crowd that were taking him off to trial, and he followed them at a distance. When he reached the courtyard of the high priest's house, he sat down with the guards to warm himself beside a fire. That's not the full story. You really have to read all of the Gospels, all four of the Gospels, to understand this better. Peter wasn't allowed into that place. The lady at the gate didn't recognise him, and so she wouldn't let him in. How did Peter get in there into that courtyard to warm himself beside the fire? John got him in. So John's not mentioned in this story, but John's an important character in this whole thing. We think of John as just being a fisherman. What's a fisherman do? He throws out his line and he pulls fish in. Well, not in those days. They used to use ships and they'd use nets, and they would throw those nets down into the water and then pull up what fish they could. We don't normally think of fishermen as being very rich people. They're often poor people. Often fishermen get as much fish as they can eat themselves in the day and sell as many as they can to get enough money just to live for that day. But John, he wasn't a poor fisherman. His father Zebedee employed other people. John didn't have the job as a fisherman just because that was the only job he could do. John was part of a family business, and he was probably a wealthy man. He had a house in Capernaum, which is close to the Lake of Galilee where he lived. He also had a house in Jerusalem, and we don't read that until after the story that Jesus said to John, Mary, I want you to be part of John's family. John, I want you to look after her. And it says from that point on, John took her to his home. So John, he wasn't a poor man. He was middling rich, probably. They had a house in Jerusalem. There were lots of other things that the story in the Gospels tell us about John. But one of the really striking things to me is that it says that John was a friend of Annas. Annas was the man who they went to this house. When Jesus was taken there, Annas was the man who wasn't the high priest, but he was the father-in-law of the high priest. Annas had been the high priest for 23 years earlier, and then he had 5 sons, and all 5 of his sons became high priests at different times. And Caiaphas was his son-in-law, his daughter's husband, his daughter's husband, and Caiaphas at this time was the high priest. So Annas was a very important man in Jewish politics. They took him first to Annas, and they had a pre-trial thing there, working out what can we do, how can we best get Jesus to convict himself so that when he goes to the Sanhedrin and we have that trial there, we'll be able to secure a conviction. You see, anger against Jesus had been growing. And part of the anger was this man, Annas. this father-in-law of Caiaphas, because history tells us that Annas was the one who set up the temple and all of those trading tables in the temple where the doves and the sheep and bulls and things were all sold. And Annas made money from those things. So history tells us that Annas was the one who really, Jesus was poking his finger in Annas's eye when he turned over the tables and liberated all of those doves and things. When he crashed all that money to the ground for the money changers. So Jesus was provoking Annas when he did those things, and now Annas has a chance to get his own back. So he was an important part of this character, of this whole plot. Another important character in this one was Pilate. Pilate was the one that they took Jesus to in the last part of this thing, in the last part of this story. And Pilate was that important that he was the one who had the chance of being able to say, yes, Jesus will be released or Jesus will die. The high priest couldn't do it. The Sanhedrin couldn't do it. Pilate was the only one who could do it. And so he was taken to Pilate. After they finished with this conversation with Annas at Caiaphas's place, they took Jesus off to Pilate. But we've got a little story in the middle there, and that little story is about Peter and about him denying Jesus 3 times. In verse 72, it reminds us that Jesus had told Peter, before a rooster crows twice, you will say 3 times that you don't know me. Of course, Peter didn't think that was going to happen. Peter thought, no, I wouldn't do that to you, Jesus. And yet it happened just the same as Jesus said. So the very next place they go to is Pilate's place. Now, Pilate, he wasn't a really good governor. He was a man who thought Rome was the best country in the whole world, and that the Jews should be doing what the Romans say. Now, way back in the Old Testament, there's a law there that says that the Jews weren't allowed to make images of anyone or anything, because they might worship those images instead of worshipping the one true God. So Pilate, early on in his time as the governor of Judea, Pilate had brought his soldiers in at night time, and they'd brought their standards. Their standards are like a banner, and on these standards was a picture of the emperor. And the Jews heard about this, and they went to Caesarea, and they went to Pilate and said to him, we don't want these in here, take them out. And this argument went on for days. And eventually Pilate said, all right, I'll give my judgment on this day. And he went and he sat in Caesarea at the marketplace there, and on his throne, his big chair. And all of the people, the Jewish people, gathered round him to tell him again what they wanted. Well, Pilate had told all of his soldiers, look, hide your weapons, hide them underneath your clothes, but surround this group. And when I give you the nod, I want you to come out and kill them. So these people came, they were all in a tight bunch, and Pilate said to his soldiers, okay, now's the time. And they all pulled out their swords, ready to kill the Jews, and the Jews said, okay, kill me, cut off my head. And all of them together were like that. Well, Pilate couldn't risk having all of these people killed at once, and so he backed down and he took all of those standards away from Jerusalem. But you see, he wasn't a very clever man from that perspective. So here he was, a man who'd made mistakes in the way he governed Judea, and he was brought this really tricky case about Jesus. What would he do? Would he do what was the right thing to do, or would he give in to the high priests who had so much power? He decided to give in. And that's what happens at the end of this story. But in bringing this whole story together, one thing that you have to remember is that there were other people involved in this story who are not mentioned here. One of them comes in a little bit later in the crucifixion story, and that's Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, if you remember, way back when Jesus was a baby, Mary and Joseph took Jesus to the temple, and there they met a man called Simeon. And Simeon was a man who had been living a long time, and God had promised him, "You will not die without seeing the Messiah." So when Simeon held this baby in his arms and realized that he was the Messiah, he said to God, "You can take me now. I've seen the Messiah. Your promise has come true." But he also said to Mary, "Mary, a sword will pierce your soul." Now that's what happens in this same story, because Mary has seen lots of different things happen over the time that Jesus has been working in Judea and Galilee. For the last 3.5 years, Jesus had been a really important figure in Jerusalem and in Judea and in Samaria and in Galilee. Very important man. And there was a lot of strife going on between the two of them. But Mary was someone who was there, not there at these things. She's not mentioned as being there, but she was seeing things going on. And you can imagine that she would have been feeling really, really upset, because Jesus had been taken by these soldiers, because Jesus had been taken to the high priest, because Jesus had been taken before Pilate, and ultimately, in the next one, we're going to see that Jesus was crucified. One man wrote a song, Clay Aiken. He wrote a song called "Mary, Did You Know?" And I'd like you to see that song. The link is on the website. I'd like you to look at that song and listen to it and imagine for yourself what it must have been like for Mary to see her son going through all of these things and eventually to die on the cross. Mary, did you know? It would be good for you to look at that Lumo recording of this event and to use the background that I've given you to understand this even more. Thank you for listening.